Sometimes the hardest journey isn't through the mountains, it's walking back through your own front door. Jacob Stern had spent 30 years carving out a life in these unforgiving peaks, and he thought he'd seen everything the wilderness could offer. Then came the day an old woman threw herself in his path, tears freezing on her weathered cheeks, begging him not to go home. He'd faced down grizzlies and outlaws without flinching, but something in her eyes made his blood run cold. What he found waiting at his cabin would shake him to his core, a truth he never saw coming, hidden right there in the pines all along. What could make a stranger risk everything to stop a mountain man from reaching his own home? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. 30 years ago, Jacob Stern had arrived in these mountains with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a heart too broken to mend in the company of other men. He'd been 28 then, lean and restless, running from a world that had taken everything he loved. The Rocky Mountains had offered him something civilization never could silence, deep enough to drown out memory, and solitude vast enough to contain his grief. He built his cabin in a high valley where the pines grew thick, and the nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away. The work had been hard, brutal even, but he'd welcomed it. Every log he cut, every stone he set, every nail he drove was a small act of forgetting. By the time the first snow fell that year, he had 4 walls, a roof, and a door that locked. It wasn't much, but it was his. The years that followed had carved him into something different than the man who'd first climbed these slopes. His hands grew calloused and sure. His eyes learned to read the mountain's moods, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the patterns animals made when predators were near, the subtle changes in the forest that spoke of seasons turning. He became part of the landscape, as much a fixture as the ancient pines that surrounded his home. His cabin had grown with him. What started as a single room now had a bedroom, a proper kitchen, and a workshop where he spent winter evenings repairing tools and crafting the things he needed. The walls were chinked tight against the cold, the roof had been re-shingled twice. A covered porch wrapped around the front, looking out over a meadow where deer came to graze at dawn. Inside, the cabin spoke of a solitary life lived with care. Hand-hewn furniture, simple but solid. Shelves lined with books, mostly histories and practical guides, but some poetry too, though he'd never admit it to another soul. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel holding a few precious items, a compass that had belonged to his father, a pocket knife worn smooth with use, and a small wooden box he never opened. His nearest neighbor, Tom Bradshaw, lived 20 miles to the east in a valley that caught more sun. Tom was 15 years older than Jacob, a former trapper who'd settled down when his joints started complaining about the cold. They'd met during Jacob's second winter, when Tom had shown up at his door with a haunch of venison and a bottle of whiskey. "Heard there was a fool living up in the high country," Tom had said, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "Thought I'd see if you were still alive." They'd become friends in the way mountain men do, seeing each other maybe once a month, sharing news and supplies, respecting each other's need for silence. Tom never asked why Jacob had come to the mountains, and Jacob never offered. Some things were understood without words. Once a week, weather permitting, Jacob made the journey to Pinewood, the small town that served the scattered population of ranchers, trappers, and hermits who called these mountains home. It was a 2-day trip there and back down from his valley, through the pine forests, across Coldwater Creek, and then along the old mining road that wound through the foothills. Pinewood wasn't much to speak of. A general store, a blacksmith, a trading post, and a saloon that doubled as the town's social center. Maybe 200 souls lived there year-round, swelling to twice that in summer when the prospectors and drifters came through. Jacob knew most folks by sight, fewer by name. He kept his interactions brief and polite, get his supplies, exchange a few words about weather or game, then head back to the peace of his mountains. The town had changed over the years. Old Macready, who'd run the general store when Jacob first arrived, had passed on, leaving the business to his daughter Emma. The blacksmith had been replaced twice. A new doctor had set up practice 3 years back, a young woman from back east who'd surprised everyone by staying through her first winter. But the rhythms remained the same gossip, the same concerns, the same slow pace of life that suited those who chose to live far from the rush of cities. Jacob's routine was as regular as the seasons. He kept a careful list of what he needed, written in the worn leather journal he carried in his saddlebag. Coffee, flour, salt, sugar, ammunition, lamp oil, sometimes fabric for mending, or nails, or a new tool to replace one that had broken. He raised his own vegetables in summer, hunted his own meat, and made do with what the land provided. But there were some things a man couldn't make in the wilderness, and for those, pinewood was essential. This particular trip had been like any other. He'd left his cabin on a Tuesday morning, the November sky clear and cold. Ranger, his 8-year-old shepherd mix, had watched him go with patient brown eyes, content to guard the homestead. The ride down had been peaceful frost glittering on pine needles, his breath and the horses making clouds in the thin mountain air. He'd reached Pinewood by evening, stabled his horse at the livery, and taken a room at the boarding house. Wednesday morning, he'd made his rounds, the general store, the trading post, a stop at the blacksmith to pick up a repaired axe head. Emma had mentioned that Tom Bradshaw had been in the week before, looking poorly. Jacob had made a mental note to check on him on the way back. The return journey had started before dawn on Thursday. His saddlebags were full, his supplies secured, his horse rested and ready. The sky had been overcast but not threatening, the kind of grey that promised snow in a day or two, but nothing immediate. He'd made good time through the foothills and across Coldwater Creek. By early afternoon, he was climbing back into the high country, into the realm of ancient pines and granite peaks that had been his home for 3 decades. The familiar landmarks passed by the lightning-struck fir that stood like a skeleton against the sky, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, the meadow where he'd once seen a pack of wolves bring down an elk. He was thinking about the work waiting at home, firewood to split before the next storm, a section of roof that needed attention, the winter stores to organize in the cellar. Simple, honest work that filled the days and asked nothing of his heart. He wasn't thinking about danger. He wasn't thinking about the past. He certainly wasn't thinking that his life was about to change forever. The trail here was narrow, carved into the mountainside, with forest rising steep on the left and falling away into a ravine on the right. He'd ridden this path 1,000 times, knew every turn and slope, which is why he saw her immediately, a dark figure standing in the middle of the trail ahead, impossible to miss against the snow that had begun to dust the ground. As he drew closer, Jacob saw it was an old woman, bundled in a heavy coat that had seen better days, her grey hair whipped around her face in the wind. She stood planted in the center of the path, and even from a distance he could see she was trembling, though whether from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. "Ma'am," he called out as he approached, slowing his horse. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, and then another, her movements urgent despite her age. When she was close enough that he could see her face clearly, Jacob felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her eyes were wild with fear, tears streaming down weathered cheeks that had already begun to freeze in the cold. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't yet hear over the wind. She reached out toward him with both hands, a gesture that was half plea, half warning. Jacob dismounted, concern overriding caution. The woman looked to be in her 70s, far too old to be out here alone in these conditions. The nearest settlement was miles away. Had she wandered off from somewhere? Was she confused? "Ma'am, you need to get out of this cold," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Let me help you." "No." The word came out as a sharp cry, stopping him in his tracks. "No, you can't go home. Please, you have to listen to me. You can't go home." She rushed forward then, closing the distance between them with surprising speed. Before Jacob could react, she had grabbed his coat with both hands, her grip stronger than he would have expected. She pulled herself close, her face inches from his, and he could see the desperation burning in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't go home, Jacob Stern. Not today. Not yet. You don't know what's waiting there. You don't understand what they've done." Jacob froze. The woman knew his name. In 30 years of living in these mountains, he could count on one hand the number of people who knew his full name. He kept to himself, introduced himself as Jake, if at all, and certainly hadn't shared it with elderly women he'd never met before. "How do you know my name?" he asked quietly, his mountain-honed instincts suddenly alert. He gently but firmly removed her hands from his coat, taking a step back to assess the situation properly. The woman's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Because she told me about you. Because I've known about you for 15 years, waiting for this day, dreading it, hoping it would never come, but knowing it would. And now it's here, and I'm too late, and you won't listen, and everything she sacrificed will be for nothing." The words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent. Jacob's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. She? Who was she talking about? 15 years ago, that was when Sarah died. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. He pushed it aside. "Ma'am, I think you might be confused," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "I don't know you, and I don't know who you're talking about, but you're going to freeze out here. Let me take you somewhere safe, and we can sort this out." "I am not confused." The woman's voice rose, sharp with frustration and fear. "My name is Martha Colby. I live in the Black Pine Valley, 40 miles from here. I've been watching for you, waiting for you to make your supply run. I hiked through the night to reach this trail before you did. Do I sound confused?" Martha Colby. The name meant nothing to him, but the details she provided were too specific to dismiss. She'd known his route, his timing. Someone had told her about him, and recently. "All right, Mrs. Colby," Jacob said slowly. "I'm listening. Why don't you want me to go home?" Martha's shoulders sagged with relief, though the fear never left her eyes. She reached into her coat with trembling hands and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Jacob saw a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. She opened it with practiced fingers and held it out to him. Inside was a photograph, faded and worn. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Jacob's breath caught in his chest. He'd know that face anywhere, even though he'd tried for 15 years to forget it. "Sarah," he whispered. "Yes," Martha said softly. "Sarah Brennan, or Sarah Stern as she became. My dearest friend, my sister in all but blood." Jacob's mind reeled. Sarah had never mentioned a Martha Colby, never spoken of the Black Pine Valley. In the 5 years they'd been married before the accident, she'd told him she had no family, no close friends. She'd been alone in the world, just like him. That's part of what had drawn them together. "Sarah never mentioned you," he said, and heard the edge in his own voice. "I know." Martha's eyes were sad but understanding. She couldn't. It was part of the promise she made, part of the price she paid for leaving. "But she wrote to me every month for 5 years. Letters I still have, letters that talk about you, about the life you built together, about how much she loved you. Letters." Jacob felt like he was grasping at fog. Nothing Martha said made sense, yet she stood before him with proof, Sarah's face in that locket, details no stranger could know. What promise? What price? Sarah died in a riding accident. She fell, hit her head. The doctor said what he saw, Martha interrupted. But he didn't know the whole truth. Neither did you. Sarah made sure of that. She wanted you to have peace, to live your life without the burden she carried. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them. Jacob's horse shifted restlessly, sensing his agitation. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew he should be moving, should be getting them both to shelter. But he stood, rooted to the spot, unable to look away from that photograph. "What burden?" he asked. Martha hesitated, and in that hesitation, Jacob saw genuine anguish. Whatever she'd come to tell him, it cost her to speak it. "There are things in these mountains, Jacob. Old things. Things that were here long before the first settlers, before the miners came looking for silver and gold. Things that should stay hidden, stay sleeping. But men dig, and they disturb, and sometimes they wake what should never be wakened." Despite himself, Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd heard stories, of course. Every old mountain range had its legends, monsters in the deep places, spirits that walked the high peaks, curses that followed those who trespassed on sacred ground. He'd always dismissed them as campfire tales, stories to frighten children and entertain lonely trappers. "You're talking about the old mine," he said. "Silver Point." Martha's eyes widened. "You know about it?" Tom Bradshaw mentioned it once. Said there was a disaster back in 47, whole crew lost, said the families left speaking of curses, but that was just grief talking. "It wasn't grief," Martha said firmly. "It was truth. Those miners found something down in the deep places, something they should have left alone. They tried to destroy it. When they couldn't, they sealed themselves inside the mountain rather than let it reach the surface. It was a noble sacrifice, but it wasn't permanent. Nothing ever is." Jacob wanted to argue, to tell her she was speaking nonsense, but something in her voice, in her eyes, in the way she stood before him, risking everything to deliver this warning, made him hesitate. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know they held secrets. He'd seen things he couldn't explain, lights in the forest at night, sounds that didn't match any animal he knew, places where even the bravest hunters refused to go. "What does this have to do with Sarah?" he asked. "With me going home?" Martha looked down at the locket in her hand, her thumb tracing the silver edge. "Sarah was descended from one of those miners. Her family, my family, we've been guardians for generations. Watching, waiting, maintaining the seals that keep the darkness contained. Sarah was raised to take her place in that duty, trained from childhood in the old ways. But she left," Jacob said. "She came to these mountains. She met me." "Yes." Martha's voice was barely audible above the wind. "She left. She fell in love with these peaks, with the freedom she'd never known. And then she met you, and she fell in love again, deeper than she'd ever thought possible. She broke her vow, abandoned her duty. She chose you over everything else." Jacob felt his throat tighten. He remembered the day he'd met Sarah, a chance encounter at the trading post in Pinewood. She'd been new to the area, looking for work, and he'd been immediately drawn to her quiet strength and gentle humor. Their courtship had been slow and careful, two wounded souls learning to trust again. When she'd agreed to marry him and share his mountain home, he'd thought himself the luckiest man alive. "The accident," he said slowly. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" Martha shook her head, tears flowing freely now. She went back. When she realized the seal was weakening, when she understood what would happen if it failed completely, she went back to Silver Point and did what needed to be done, what only someone of the bloodline could do. She sacrificed herself. The words felt like stones in Jacob's mouth. She bought time, 15 years of time. She strengthened the seal with her own life, hoping that would be enough, that maybe another way could be found. But the seal is failing again, Jacob, and there are others there now, at your cabin. They've been waiting for you, watching for you. They need something from you, something only you can give. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "What could I possibly have that—" "The box," Martha interrupted. "The wooden box Sarah kept. The one you've never opened, never looked inside. They're searching for it because it contains her final instructions, her last gift to you and to the world. The Guardians need it to complete what she started." The blood drained from Jacob's face. The box. He kept it on his mantle, a painful reminder of the wife he'd lost. She'd made him promise, in those last fevered moments before she died, never to open it. "Wait 10 years," she'd whispered. "Then you'll understand." But when 10 years had passed, he still couldn't bear to look inside. The grief was still too raw, the loss too deep. "They're in my home," he said flatly. "Going through my things, taking what's mine." "They mean no harm," Martha said quickly. "They're trying to save lives, Jacob. If the seal breaks completely, if what's beneath gets free." "I don't care about seals or curses or ancient evil." Jacob cut her off, his voice harder than he'd intended. "That's my home. Sarah or no Sarah, guardians or no guardians, no one has the right to break into a man's home and rifle through his life." He turned toward his horse, done with this conversation. His mind was churning with too many emotions: anger at the intrusion, confusion about Sarah's hidden past, grief reopened like a fresh wound. He needed to get home, needed to see with his own eyes what was happening. Martha grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. "Please, Jacob, please listen. They're trying to help, but if you go back there now, if you interrupt what they're doing, you could destroy everything. The timing has to be perfect. The ritual requires—" "Let go of me," Jacob said quietly. Something in his tone made Martha release him. She stepped back, her face a mask of despair. "She loved you so much," she whispered. "She wanted to protect you from all of this. That's why she never told you, why she made sure you'd never have to know. But you have to know now. You have to understand what's at stake." Jacob mounted his horse, his movements stiff with barely controlled emotion. He looked down at Martha, this stranger who claimed to have been Sarah's friend, who'd hiked through the night to warn him. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to understand. But the larger part, the part that had built a life on self-reliance and simple truths, rebelled against everything she'd said. "I'm going home," he said. "You should get to shelter before the storm hits." "Jacob, please." But he was already urging his horse forward, moving around her on the narrow trail. She called after him, her voice breaking with desperation. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. His home was waiting, and whatever was happening there, he would face it on his own terms. Behind him, Martha Colby collapsed to her knees in the snow, sobbing his name and another name, Sarah's name, over and over into the wind. Jacob didn't sleep that night. He built a fire in the abandoned camp, trying to recreate some warmth in the frozen darkness, but comfort eluded him. His mind churned with questions, memories, and growing suspicions that refused to settle. At first light, he broke camp and continued following the trail. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. Everything looked clean and new, as if the mountain was trying to erase what had happened. But Jacob wasn't ready for erasure. He needed answers first. The trail led higher into terrain he rarely visited. This was old country, the kind of land that predated the settlers and trappers, where the bones of the earth showed through in granite outcroppings and ancient stone. The trees here were different too, twisted by wind and age into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost watchful. By mid-morning he could see where he was headed. In the distance, barely visible through the pines, stood the remnants of Silver Point. The old mining settlement was little more than collapsed buildings and rotting timbers now, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Jacob had passed near it a few times over the years, but had never felt compelled to explore. It was a graveyard, a monument to failed dreams and violent death. There was nothing there for him, or so he'd thought. As he drew closer, he began to notice things that didn't fit with a long-abandoned site. Fresh tracks. For one, not just the group he'd been following, but older tracks, suggesting regular visits over weeks or even months. Someone had cleared some of the underbrush from the main path. A few of the building foundations showed signs of recent excavation, as if people had been searching through the ruins. Jacob's mind went back to Tom Bradshaw's warnings, spoken years ago over a bottle of whiskey on a cold winter night. "Don't go poking around Silver Point," Tom had said, his face serious in the firelight. "Nothing good ever came from that place, and nothing good ever will. The old folks used to say the mountain was cursed there, that the miners dug too deep and found something they shouldn't have." At the time, Jacob had assumed Tom was just repeating old superstitions, the kind of tall tales that got passed down and embellished with each telling. Now, he wondered how much truth those stories contained. The settlement appeared deserted as Jacob approached, but he moved carefully anyway, using the cover of trees and collapsed structures. He found the group's trail leading to what had once been the assayer's office, one of the few buildings still partially intact. Signs of habitation were everywhere. Fresh wood stacked near a makeshift shelter, cooking supplies arranged under a tarp, sleeping rolls laid out in protected corners. And in the center of it all, arranged with almost ceremonial precision, was a brass compass. Not a simple directional compass, but an ornate antique piece with a face that showed more than just cardinal directions. Jacob picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands. The needle didn't point north. Instead, it pointed steadily toward the mountainside, toward what Jacob now recognized as the entrance to the old Silver Point mine. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, sealed with fallen rock and rotting timbers. But someone had been working to clear it. Fresh tool marks scarred the old wood. Rocks had been moved and stacked, and there, driven into a timber above the entrance, was a symbol carved deep into the wood, a circle with radiating lines, like a sun or a star. Jacob had seen that symbol before. Sarah had worn a pendant with the same design, a simple silver piece she'd claimed was a family heirloom. He'd buried it with her, thinking it was just jewelry. Now he understood it was something more, a mark of the Guardians, perhaps, or a ward against whatever lay beneath the mountain. He stood before the mine entrance for a long time, the brass compass heavy in his hand, pointing insistently at the darkness beyond the fallen timbers. Part of him wanted to turn around, to ride straight to Tom's place and demand explanations. But another part, the part that had driven him to track these people through a storm, that had kept him going despite exhaustion and confusion, that part wanted to go inside, wanted to see what had claimed his wife's life, wanted to understand what Sarah had thought was worth dying for. A sound behind him made him spin, rifle rising. But it was only a woman, elderly and wrapped in heavy furs, emerging from the shelter of the assayer's office. Not Martha Colby, but someone who shared that same weathered strength, that same look of having seen too much and carried too heavy a burden for too long. "Jacob Stern," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "We've been expecting you. You broke into my home," Jacob said flatly, "stole my property, terrorized my dog." "We did what was necessary," the woman replied, unbowed by his anger, "and we left you provisions in fair trade. More than fair, considering what we needed to know. Who are you?" "My name is Elizabeth Gray. I knew Sarah. I taught her, in fact, when she was young, taught her the old ways, the old knowledge. She was my finest student, and her loss broke my heart." Jacob felt something crack inside him at those words. Here was someone else who'd known Sarah, who'd been part of her hidden life. "She never mentioned you, never mentioned any of this." "She was protecting you," Elizabeth said gently. "From knowledge that would have demanded action, from a burden she hoped you'd never have to carry. Sarah loved you more than duty, more than destiny. That was both her great strength and her great weakness. Martha said Sarah sacrificed herself, that she died to strengthen some kind of seal. Martha told you the truth, as far as she understood it. But there's more to the story, Jacob. There's always more." Elizabeth gestured toward the mine entrance. "The men who died here in 1847 weren't just miners. They were the first guardians, men who discovered something in the deep places that should never have been disturbed. They tried to destroy it. When they couldn't, they made the only choice they could. They sealed it away, and themselves with it. And Sarah was descended from them. From one of them, yes, her great-great-grandfather was Samuel Brennan, the foreman of the mine. He was the last one out before they set the charges that collapsed the entrance. He survived long enough to pass on the knowledge of what they'd found, what they'd done, and what would be needed in the years to come. Jacob shook his head, trying to process it all. You're telling me there's something evil sealed in that mine, and Sarah died to keep it there? Evil is a simple word for a complex thing, Elizabeth said. What's in there is old, Jacob, older than our understanding. It doesn't think like we do, doesn't want what we want. But yes, if it were free, it would be catastrophic. Sarah understood that. She made her choice with open eyes. And now you're here, digging at the entrance. Why? Elizabeth's face grew grave. Because the seal is failing. We can feel it, those of us with the sensitivity. The mountain is restless. Animals are fleeing the area, you must have noticed. Tom Bradshaw has fallen ill with no cause the doctors can name. These are the signs, Jacob. The same signs that appeared 15 years ago, before Sarah did what she did. Then seal it again, Jacob said harshly. Do whatever ritual needs doing. Don't drag me into this. It's not that simple. Elizabeth reached into her coat and pulled out a familiar object, Sarah's wooden box. We needed to read her journals, to understand what she learned, what she discovered. The traditional ritual requires a sacrifice of the bloodline. But Sarah found something different, something that might work without death. She left instructions, Jacob, instructions that require you. Jacob stared at the box, then at Elizabeth. Me? I'm not part of your bloodline. I'm not a guardian or whatever you call yourselves. No, Elizabeth agreed. But you were bound to Sarah. You loved her, and she loved you. That creates a different kind of bond, one that might be strong enough. She believed it was. She spent the last months of her life researching, preparing, leaving you the knowledge you'd need when the time came. And if I refuse? Elizabeth's eyes were sad but unflinching. Then one of us will have to do what Sarah did. We'll strengthen the seal with our lives, by another decade or two. And when that fails, someone else will make the same choice. Until eventually, there's no one left who knows, no one who remembers, and the seal breaks completely. Jacob took the box from her hands, feeling its familiar weight. What did Sarah want me to do? Read her journals, understand what she learned. Then decide if you're willing to help us complete what she started, a permanent seal that won't require death to maintain. But it will require something from you, Jacob. It will require you to give up the life you've known and accept a new role. One that will tie you to this place, to this mountain, for as long as you live. The brass compass in Jacob's other hand seemed to grow heavier, its needle still pointing steadily toward the mine entrance, toward the darkness, toward the choice that waited for him in the deep places of the mountain. Elizabeth led Jacob into the assayer's office, where the other guardians waited. 6 women in total, ranging in age from their 50s to what must have been 80 or more. Each had the same weathered look, the same quiet strength. These were not city folk playing at wilderness survival. These were women who knew the mountains, who'd lived hard lives and made harder choices. Martha Colby was among them, her face lighting with relief when she saw Jacob. "You came," she said simply. "I followed you," Jacob corrected. "That's not the same thing." They'd made a rough camp inside the old building. A fire burned in what had once been a stone hearth. The women had arranged their supplies with military precision, everything in its place, everything serving a purpose. On a makeshift table made from old planks, Jacob saw maps of the mountain, detailed drawings of the mine entrance, and what looked like pages copied from very old books. Elizabeth gestured for him to sit. "We have food if you're hungry. Coffee, at least. You look like you've been through a rough night." Jacob sat, more because his legs were tired than because he wanted to accept their hospitality. Ranger settled at his feet, still wary but no longer terrified. The dog seemed to sense these women meant no immediate harm. One of the guardians, a woman with kind eyes and graying black hair, poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to Jacob. "I'm the one who left you the note," she said, "about Sarah saving my daughter. My name is Catherine Porter. I wanted you to know that whatever else happens, whatever you think of us, your wife was a good woman, a healer and a friend." Jacob took the coffee but said nothing. He didn't trust himself to speak about Sarah right now, not with these strangers who seemed to know her better than he had. Elizabeth set Sarah's wooden box on the table in front of him. "We didn't take anything from it," she said. "We only read what was inside. You should read it too. It's your right, and more than that, it's necessary. You need to understand what Sarah understood." Jacob stared at the box. For 15 years, he'd honored Sarah's request not to open it. For 15 years, it had sat on his mantle, a promise kept to a dying woman. Now these strangers had violated that promise, and they were asking him to do the same. "She said to wait 10 years, he said quietly. "And you did," Elizabeth replied. "You waited 10 years, and then 5 more beyond that. You kept faith with her, Jacob. But Sarah knew that when the time came when we came for you, you'd need to know the truth." With hands that weren't quite steady, Jacob opened the box. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed with age, covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. Beneath them was a sealed letter with his name written on the envelope in Sarah's hand. He took out the letter first, breaking the seal that had held for 15 years. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and Sarah's words leaped out at him. "My dearest Jacob, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the guardians have found you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the secrets, for the lies, for all the truth I kept hidden. I told myself it was to protect you, to give you peace. But perhaps I was also protecting myself from your reaction, from your judgment, from the possibility that you might love me less if you knew. I came to these mountains with a purpose, a duty passed down through my family for generations. I was supposed to watch, to wait, to be ready when the seal began to fail. But then I met you, and everything changed. You showed me what it meant to live, truly live, rather than just exist in service to the past. I fell in love with you, Jacob. That was never part of the plan. That was never supposed to happen. But it did, and I've never regretted it. The 5 years we had together were the happiest of my life. You gave me something I never thought I'd have: a home, a partner, a reason to smile when I woke each morning. When the seal began to fail, I had a choice to make. I could do my duty as I was trained, or I could find another way. I spent the last months of our marriage researching, studying the old texts, looking for an alternative to the traditional sacrifice. I found something, Jacob. Not a perfect solution, but a possibility. A way to create a permanent seal that wouldn't require death to maintain. But I ran out of time. The seal was failing faster than I expected, and I had to act. What I did bought us 15 years' time for the guardians to prepare, time for you to heal from losing me, time for the right circumstances to align. The ritual I discovered requires 2 things, knowledge and love. The guardians will teach you the knowledge. The love is already there, the bond we forged, the connection we built. Even in death, I'm tied to you, Jacob. And you're tied to this mountain through me. If you choose to help them, you'll have to give up your freedom. You'll be bound to this place, unable to leave for long, always aware of the mountain's rhythms and moods. It's not an easy life. I know, because it's the life I was born to and tried to escape. But if you choose this path, you'll be saving lives. You'll be protecting the innocent people who live in these mountains, who have no idea what sleeps beneath their feet. And you'll be honoring what we had, what we built together. The choice is yours, my love. The guardians won't force you. They can't. The ritual only works if you come to it willingly, with full understanding of what you're accepting. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you. Know that every moment we shared was real. Know that if I had it to do over, I'd make the same choices, all of them, just to have those 5 years with you. Yours always, Sarah. Jacob read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. Around him, the guardians sat in respectful silence, giving him space to grieve, to rage, to process. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his jaw was set. "I need to read the journals," he said. "All of them. I need to understand exactly what you're asking of me." Elizabeth nodded. "We have time. Not much, but enough for you to read, to learn, to decide. The alignment we need won't happen for another 3 days. The moon must be dark, the stars in the right positions. Until then, we wait. And if I say no," it was Martha who answered, her voice heavy with sorrow, "then I'll do it. I'm the oldest, and I have the bloodline. I'll perform the old ritual, the one that requires a life. I'll give mine gladly, if it means my grandchildren and their children can live in safety." Jacob looked at her, at this woman who'd thrown herself in his path to warn him, who'd wept in the snow when he'd ridden past. "You have grandchildren?" "3, Martha said with a sad smile. "Beautiful children who don't know anything about guardians or seals or the burden their family carries. I'd like to keep it that way. I'd like them to grow up free of this weight." Jacob turned back to the journals, to Sarah's handwriting that covered page after page. "Then I better start reading." Jacob spent 2 days reading Sarah's journals while the guardians prepared for the ritual. He read by firelight and daylight, consuming page after page of his wife's careful documentation. What he learned transformed everything he thought he knew about Sarah, about himself, and about the life they'd shared. The first journal detailed Sarah's childhood training. She'd been raised in a small community of guardians in the eastern mountains, taught from age 5 about the ancient thing sealed beneath Silver Point. The guardians called it many names, none of which Jacob could pronounce. Sarah had settled on calling it the Sleeper, a thing that existed before humans, that had been sealed away by forces even older than itself. The second journal covered her years of research, her growing doubt about the traditional rituals. Sarah had been brilliant, Jacob realized, with a mix of pride and pain. She'd studied not just the guardian traditions, but compared them to indigenous stories, to geological surveys, to scientific theories about the Earth's formation. She'd been trying to understand the sleeper not as a supernatural threat, but as a natural phenomenon that could be managed through knowledge rather than just blood sacrifice. But it was the third journal that shook Jacob to his core. This one began the day Sarah met him, and it chronicled their entire relationship from her perspective. He saw himself through her eyes, wounded but strong, gentle, despite his rough exterior, someone who'd built a good life from the ruins of a broken heart. She'd fallen for him gradually, fighting it at first, knowing it meant abandoning her duty. Then came the entries from the last months of her life. "The seal is failing. I can feel it in my bones, in my dreams. The sleeper is stirring, reaching out with tendrils of influence that manifest as nightmares and sickness in those sensitive to its presence. Tom Bradshaw fell ill last week with a fever no doctor can explain. I know what it means. I'm running out of time. I could tell Jacob. Part of me desperately wants to. But what would I say? Darling, I've been lying to you our entire marriage. I'm actually part of an ancient order tasked with keeping an incomprehensible entity sealed beneath the mountain, and I'm probably going to have to die soon to maintain that seal. He'd think I'd gone mad. And even if he believed me, what then? He'd want to help, want to find another way. But there is no other way, not yet. I'm close to a breakthrough in my research, so close. I think I've found a method that could create a permanent seal using the bond of love rather than the sacrifice of blood. But I need more time to test it, to be sure. Time I don't have. The ritual must be performed before the dark of the moon. That's 3 weeks away. If I do nothing, the seal will break completely within months. People will die not just in these mountains, but beyond. The sleeper's influence spreads like a disease when it wakes. History shows us that much, recorded in the old texts that speak of plagues and madness that swept through regions before the ancient seals were placed. I've made my decision. I'll perform the traditional ritual. I'll strengthen the seal with my life, buying another decade or two. In that time, the Guardians can study my research, can perfect what I started, and Jacob will be free of this burden. He'll grieve, but he'll survive. He's stronger than he knows. I'm going to make it look like an accident, a fall while riding. Quick, painless, no suspicion. The Guardians will understand what I've done. They'll honor it. And Jacob will remember me as his wife, not as a guardian who lied to him for 5 years. I love him so much it physically hurts, but this is the only way I can protect him and fulfill my duty. Some choices aren't really choices at all. Jacob had to stop reading there, the journal shaking in his hands. Sarah had planned her death, had chosen it deliberately, methodically. The riding accident that had destroyed his world had been a calculated sacrifice, performed out of love and duty in equal measure. He forced himself to continue. The final entries detailed Sarah's last preparations, her fears and hopes. And then, 3 days before her death, a discovery that changed everything. I found it. I finally found it. Hidden in a text so old the Guardians had forgotten its existence, written in a dialect I barely recognize. There is a way to create a permanent seal without death. It requires a bonding ritual. 2 souls linked by love, performed at the moment of the dark moon, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. But there's a cost. The person who performs the ritual becomes permanently tied to the mountain, to the seal itself. They can never leave for long. They become a living anchor, their life force sustaining the barrier that keeps the sleeper contained. It's not death, but it's not freedom either. I could do it with Jacob. Our love is strong enough. Our bond is real enough. But it would mean telling him everything, asking him to give up his freedom, binding him to a duty he never asked for. How can I do that to him? How can I ask that sacrifice when he's already sacrificed so much, already fled to these mountains seeking peace? I'm out of time. The dark moon is tomorrow night. I have to choose. Perform the traditional ritual and die, or tell Jacob the truth and ask him to share this burden with me forever. I choose to protect him. I choose to let him live free. I choose to make the sacrifice alone, as Guardians have done for generations. But I'm writing down everything I've learned, everything I've discovered. I'm sealing it in the box with instructions not to open it for 10 years. By then, the seal will be failing again. By then, the Guardians will need this knowledge. If Jacob reads this, if he chooses to help them, he'll do it with full knowledge of what he's accepting. He'll do it as a choice, not as something I forced on him. That's the only gift I can give him now, the freedom to choose, even if I can't choose for myself. Tomorrow night, I ride to Silver Point. I perform the ritual. And Jacob goes on living, free of this burden, free to remember our love without the taint of all these secrets and lies. I'm sorry, my darling. I'm so sorry. But I love you too much to ask you to share this darkness with me. The journal ended there. Jacob sat in silence, staring at Sarah's final words. She'd found the answer. She'd discovered the way to create a permanent seal, and she'd died anyway, choosing to protect him rather than ask for his help. Around him, the Guardians waited quietly. They'd read the journals too, had known what they contained. Now they watched him process the truth, understanding the weight of what he carried. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. She loved you enough to die for you, Jacob. The question now is whether you love her enough to live for what she died protecting. Jacob looked up, his eyes dry but hard. You knew all this. You've known for 15 years that Sarah found a better way. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why wait until now? We honored her wishes, Elizabeth said simply. She asked for 10 years before you opened the box. We gave you 15, but the seal is failing faster this time. Sarah's sacrifice bought less time than we hoped. We can feel the sleeper's influence spreading. Tom's illness is just the beginning. If we don't act now, within months, the seal will break completely. And this ritual, Jacob said, touching the journal, you're sure it will work? We're sure of the theory. Martha said, Sarah was brilliant. Her research is sound, but it's never been tested. The traditional ritual has been performed dozens of times over the centuries. We know it works because we've seen it work. This new way. It's a leap of faith. Faith in Sarah, Jacob said. Yes. Jacob stood, walking to the entrance of the assayer's office. Outside, the mountain loomed, beautiful and terrible. He'd loved these peaks for 30 years, had thought he knew them. Now he understood they were hiding something ancient, something that had slept here long before humans arrived and would remain long after humans were gone. He thought about Sarah, young and brave and torn between duty and love. He thought about her riding to Silver Point alone, facing death so he could live in ignorance and peace. He thought about all the mornings he'd woken to find her watching him sleep, all the evenings they'd sat together on their porch watching the sunset, all the small moments of joy she'd given him while carrying such a terrible weight. She'd chosen to protect him. Now he had to choose whether to honor her sacrifice by accepting her gift of freedom or by completing what she'd started. He turned back to the Guardians. Tell me exactly what the ritual requires. Tell me what I'll have to give up, what I'll have to become, and then I'll decide. In the firelight, Elizabeth smiled a sad, knowing smile that spoke of hard choices made and harder consequences accepted. That, she said, is exactly what Sarah knew you'd say. The Guardians explained the ritual in detail, holding nothing back. Jacob appreciated their honesty, even as the reality of what they were asking settled over him like a heavy cloak. The bonding ritual required 3 elements: knowledge, love, and sacrifice. The knowledge part was straightforward. Jacob needed to understand what the sleeper was, what the seal did, and how the ritual would work. The Guardians spent hours teaching him, showing him maps and diagrams, explaining the history that went back thousands of years. The sleeper, they said, wasn't evil in any human sense. It was simply other, a form of existence that predated conscious thought, that operated on principles humans couldn't comprehend. When it was awake, its mere presence caused disruption in the natural order. Animals went mad, plants withered, people fell sick with fevers and nightmares. Not through malice, but simply because human reality couldn't accommodate something so fundamentally alien. The ancient seal wasn't a physical barrier, but a resonance, a harmonic frequency that kept the sleeper in a state between waking and sleeping. The original seal had been placed by forces the Guardians didn't fully understand, perhaps by the indigenous peoples who'd lived here before recorded history, perhaps by something even older. Over the millennia, the seal had weakened, requiring periodic renewal through blood sacrifice. Sarah's discovery was that love created its own resonance, its own harmonic frequency. 2 souls deeply bonded could generate a pattern that was self-sustaining, drawing on the connection between them rather than on life force alone. But it required one of those souls to become permanently attuned to the mountain, to the seal, to the sleeper itself. You'll feel it always, Elizabeth explained. The mountain's moods, the seal's strength, the sleeper's stirrings. You'll know when storms are coming before the clouds form. You'll sense when animals are in distress. You'll be aware of the seal in a way that's hard to describe, like knowing your own heartbeat, like breathing. And I can't leave, Jacob said. You can leave, Martha corrected. But not for long. A few days, perhaps, before you feel the pull to return. The farther you go, the weaker you'll feel. The seal needs your presence, your attention. It feeds on the love you and Sarah shared, using that as fuel to maintain itself. Sarah's been dead for 15 years. Love doesn't die with the body, Catherine said softly. Not the kind of love you two had. She's gone, but the bond remains. You still carry her in your heart, still think of her, still grieve for her. That connection is real, and it's strong enough to power the seal if you're willing to anchor it here. Jacob absorbed this, trying to imagine what it would mean. He'd come to these mountains seeking solitude and peace. Now he was being asked to tie himself even more deeply to them, to become part of them in a way that went beyond simple residence. "What about the sacrifice part?" he asked. Elizabeth pulled out a ceremonial knife, ancient and beautifully crafted. The handle was carved from some dark wood, inlaid with silver symbols that matched the pendant Sarah used to wear. The blade gleamed with careful maintenance despite its obvious age. "The ritual requires blood," she said. "Not death, but an offering. You'll make a cut here," she indicated her palm, "and press your hand to the seal stone at the mine entrance while speaking the binding words. Your blood will mix with the stone, with the earth, with the mountain itself. It will create a physical anchor for the metaphysical bond. And if it doesn't work?" The guardians exchanged glances. Finally, Martha spoke. "Then the seal continues to fail, and I perform the traditional ritual. I die, the seal strengthens, and we have another decade or two before someone else has to make the same choice." "No pressure," Jacob said dryly. Martha smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Sarah believed in you, Jacob. She believed you were strong enough to do this. I have to think she knew what she was doing." The next day and a half passed in preparation. The guardians had been working on clearing the mine entrance, but carefully, reverently. They weren't trying to open it that would be disastrous, but rather to expose the seal stone, a large piece of granite carved with symbols so old their meaning had been lost and relearned dozens of times through the generations. Jacob helped with the work, needing the physical activity to quiet his mind. As they moved rocks and cleared debris, he found himself thinking about Sarah in new ways. He'd spent 15 years grieving the woman he'd lost. Now he was learning to appreciate the woman she'd actually been braver than he'd known, more brilliant than he'd suspected, carrying burdens he couldn't have imagined. In quiet moments, the guardians shared their own stories. Catherine told him about the time Sarah had saved her daughter from fever, riding through a blizzard with medicines made from herbs she'd gathered herself. Martha described how Sarah used to visit the isolated homesteads, bringing not just healing but conversation and companionship to people who rarely saw another soul. "She was lonely," Martha said as they took a break from the work. "Even with you, even in love, she was lonely, because she couldn't share all of herself with you. She couldn't tell you about the weight she carried, the fear she lived with. That's the hardest part of being a guardian, the isolation of knowing things you can't speak about." "That won't be a problem for me," Jacob said. "I'm used to being alone." "Alone is different from lonely," Elizabeth observed. "And you won't be entirely alone anymore. You'll be connected to the mountain, to the seal, to something larger than yourself." Some guardians find that comforting, others find it oppressive. Which was Sarah? Both, I think. She found strength in the connection, but she also resented it. That's why she tried so hard to find a better way, a way that wouldn't require the complete surrender the old rituals demanded. As the dark of the moon approached, Jacob made a trip back to his cabin. He needed to check on it, to feed Ranger properly, to make sure everything was secure. The guardians offered to accompany him, but he refused. He needed time alone to think, to make his final decision. The cabin still felt wrong, but less so than before. Ranger was willing to enter now, though he stayed close to Jacob's side. Jacob spent time reading Sarah's journals again, looking for something he might have missed, some sign that would make his choice easier. He found it in a small note tucked into the back of the third journal, written in Sarah's hand, but never dated. "To my Jacob, if you're reading this, you know everything. You know what I was, what I hid, what I chose. I hope you can forgive me for the deception. I hope you understand why I couldn't tell you, Couldn't ask you to share this burden. But more than that, I hope you know how much those 5 years meant to me. You gave me a taste of normal life, of simple happiness. You showed me what it was like to wake up without the weight of duty pressing down on my shoulders. Even knowing it couldn't last, even knowing what was coming, I treasured every moment. If you choose to help the Guardians, know that I'll be with you in some way. Not as a ghost, I don't believe in those, but as a memory, a presence, a love that transcends death. The bond we forged was real. Jacob, it was the realest thing in my life. And if it can be used to protect the innocent, to keep the darkness contained, then our love will have served a purpose beyond just making two broken people whole. Choose with your eyes open, my darling. Choose what you can live with. And whatever you decide, know that I loved you. I love you. I will always love you. Forever yours, Sarah. Jacob folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. He looked around his cabin at the life he'd built, the solitude he'd cultivated, the peace he'd found in these mountains. All of it was about to change, one way or another. He could refuse. He could let Martha make her sacrifice, buy another decade or two of freedom. By the time the seal failed again, he'd be in his 60s, maybe too old for the Guardians to ask anything of him. He could live out his days in peace, never knowing if the ritual would have worked, never testing Sarah's faith in him. Or he could step forward. He could honor Sarah's memory by completing what she'd started. He could trust in her research, in her love, in the bond they'd shared. He could become something more than just a hermit in the wilderness, a guardian, a protector, a living seal against ancient darkness. Ranger looked up at him with trusting brown eyes, and Jacob realized the dog had already decided. Ranger would follow him wherever he went, whatever he chose to become. That kind of simple, uncomplicated loyalty shamed Jacob's hesitation. "What do you think, boy?" he said softly. "Should I do it?" Ranger's tail wagged, just once. Not much of an answer, but somehow it was enough. Jacob secured the cabin one final time, banking the fire, closing the shutters, making sure everything was protected against the coming winter. He didn't know if he'd be living here anymore after the ritual. The Guardians had mentioned he'd need to stay close to the seal, which might mean moving to the old settlement at Silver Point. His life was about to be uprooted either way. But as he stepped off the porch with Ranger at his heels, Jacob felt something shift inside him. Not peace, exactly, not certainty, but a sense of rightness, of purpose, of stepping into a role that had been waiting for him all along. Sarah had died believing in him, believing he was strong enough to carry this burden if asked. The least he could do was prove her right. He rode back to Silver Point as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow night, the moon would be dark. Tomorrow night, he would make his choice final. Tomorrow night, he would either become a guardian or watch Martha sacrifice herself. But in his heart, Jacob already knew which path he would take. Sarah had given him 5 years of happiness. It was time to honor that gift. By completing what she'd started, by protecting what she'd died to protect. The mountains rose around him, ancient and indifferent. But tomorrow, if the ritual worked, they would know him, and he would know them in return, bound together for as long as his life endured. The ritual began with fire. The Guardians had prepared 7 small fires in a circle around the seal stone, each representing one of the women who'd devoted their lives to this duty. As the last light left the sky and the moon's absence made the darkness complete, they lit the fires in sequence, chanting continuously. Jacob stood before the seal stone, the ceremonial knife in his hand. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with history and purpose. Elizabeth had shown him where to cut a diagonal line across his palm, deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to cause permanent damage. "When you press your hand to the stone," she'd instructed, "speak the words from Sarah's journal. Speak them clearly and with intent. The ritual responds to will as much as to action. Jacob had memorized the words, ancient phrases that Sarah had translated and annotated. They spoke of binding and protection, of love transcending death, of a willing sacrifice made in service to the innocent. As he held the knife to his palm, he whispered them once to himself, feeling their weight on his tongue. The guardian's chanting reached a crescendo. The fires burned brighter, casting dancing shadows on the mountainside. And Jacob, thinking of Sarah, thinking of the life she'd given up and the hope she'd left behind, drew the blade across his palm. The pain was sharp but clean. Blood welled immediately, dark in the firelight. Jacob didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and pressed his bleeding palm against the seal stone, right over the central symbol, a circle within a circle, representing containment and eternity. The stone was ice cold. The shock of it against his cut palm made him gasp, but he held firm, speaking the ritual words loud and clear. By blood and bone, by love and loss, I bind myself to this ancient task. I am the seal and the guardian. I am the barrier and the watcher. I stand between the sleeping dark and the waking world. By the bond I shared with Sarah Brennan, by the love that death cannot diminish, I anchor this protection for as long as breath fills my lungs and will strengthens my heart. The moment the final word left his lips, everything changed. The seal stone blazed with light, not fire, but something colder and stranger, like starlight, concentrated and magnified. It poured from the carved symbols, flowing up Jacob's arm, spreading through his body like ice water in his veins. He tried to pull away but couldn't. His hand was locked to the stone, held by forces he couldn't comprehend. And then he felt it, the sleeper, fully aware now, pressing against the barrier between worlds. It wasn't malevolent, he realized with a shock. It was simply too vast, too other, too fundamentally wrong for this reality. Being near it was like standing too close to the sun. Not evil, just incompatible with human existence. But between him and the sleeper, he felt something else. A presence he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. Sarah, not her ghost, not her spirit, but the imprint of her love, the resonance of their bond, preserved somehow in the seal she'd strengthened with her death. She was there in the pattern of the ritual, in the structure of the barrier, in the very fabric of what kept the sleeper contained. And now Jacob was joining her, his own love and will and sacrifice weaving into the pattern, creating something new, something stronger, something that wouldn't fail as the old seals had failed, that wouldn't need periodic renewal through death. The guardian's chanting shifted, became something triumphant. Jacob could feel the seal transforming under his hand, the ancient symbols rewriting themselves, incorporating new patterns that incorporated Sarah's research and his own willing participation. Images flooded his mind, not memories, but understanding. He saw the full history of the seal, going back thousands of years. He saw the indigenous shamans who'd first contained the sleeper, using rituals now lost to time. He saw the miners of 1847 who'd accidentally weakened the seal and sacrificed themselves to restore it. He saw Sarah's ancestor, Samuel Brennan, the last man out before the charges were set, carrying the guilt and responsibility that would define his bloodline for generations. He saw Sarah herself, 15 years ago, standing where he stood now, making the same choice, but alone, without support, dying so he could live in ignorance and peace. He felt the echo of her love, her fear, her courage, and he felt her relief because she could sense him now, sense what he was doing, and she knew her faith in him had been justified. The light grew brighter, almost unbearable. The mountain itself seemed to shudder and settle, as if a long tension was finally being released. Jacob felt the seal lock into place, not as a temporary patch, but as a permanent fixture, sustained by the love he and Sarah had shared and would continue to share across the barrier of death. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the pressure released. Jacob's hand came free from the stone, his palm healed completely, showing not even a scar from the cut he'd made. He staggered backward, caught by Martha and Catherine before he could fall. It worked, Elizabeth breathed, her voice filled with wonder. By all the old gods and new, it actually worked. Jacob looked at the seal stone and saw that it had changed. The old symbols remained, but new ones had appeared around them, interweaving with the ancient marks to create a pattern that was beautiful and complex and absolutely right. The stone hummed with energy, not the dying resonance of a failing seal, but the strong, steady pulse of something built to last. More than that, Jacob could feel it. Feel the mountain, feel the seal, feel the sleeper, contained now not by slowly weakening magic, but by a living bond that would last as long as he did. And through it all, like a golden thread woven through everything, he felt Sarah's love, still present, still real, still protecting him even in death. He'd done it. He'd honored her sacrifice by completing her work. He'd become what she'd needed him to be. "Welcome, guardian," Elizabeth said softly. "Welcome to your new life." Dawn came to the mountain with a clarity Jacob had never experienced before. Every color seemed brighter, every sound more distinct. He could hear the individual voices of birds in the forest, could feel the subtle vibrations of small animals moving through the underbrush, could sense the deep, slow breathing of the mountain itself. The guardians had left before sunrise, slipping away quietly to return to their homes and their lives. They'd said their goodbyes with tears and gratitude, each woman touching the seal stone one final time before departing. Martha had been the last to leave, embracing Jacob with unexpected strength. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "My grandchildren will grow up safe because of what you did. Sarah chose well when she chose you." Now Jacob stood alone before the seal stone, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. Ranger sat at his feet, calm and content. The dog had accepted the change in his master without question, sensing perhaps that Jacob was still fundamentally the same person, just more connected to this place they both called home. Jacob could feel the seal's strength, steady and sure. It no longer required vigilance or periodic renewal. It was self-sustaining, drawing on the bond he'd forged with Sarah, on the love that had survived her death and grown into something larger than either of them had imagined. He understood now what Elizabeth had meant about being tied to the mountain. He couldn't leave for long, a week perhaps, before the seal would begin to weaken, but he had no desire to leave anyway. This was where he belonged. His cabin waited for him, just a few hours' walk away. But it would be different now. Not wrong, as it had felt after the Guardian's intrusion, but transformed. He was transformed. The solitary hermit who'd fled civilization 30 years ago had become something more, a guardian, a protector, a living anchor for ancient magic. Before leaving Silver Point, Jacob retrieved the brass compass from his pack. It no longer pointed toward the mine. Instead, the needle spun lazily, unable to find a direction, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. He considered leaving it at the seal stone as an offering, but instead tucked it into his coat pocket, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He made one stop on the way home at Tom Bradshaw's place. The old trapper was on his porch when Jacob rode up, looking healthier than he had in months. The grey pallor was gone from his face, the weakness from his limbs. "Well, I'll be," Tom said, breaking into a wide grin. "You look different, Jake. Can't quite put my finger on it, but something's changed." "Feels different, too," Jacob admitted. "How are you feeling, Tom?" "Strangest thing. Woke up this morning feeling like a new man. Whatever fever had hold of me, it's gone. Doctor's going to be scratching her head when I tell her." Tom studied Jacob more carefully. "This have anything to do with you?" "Indirectly," Jacob said. He'd already decided not to hide the truth from Tom. The old trapper had lived in these mountains too long, had seen too much, to dismiss the reality of what existed here. You know those old stories about Silver Point? About the curse? I know them. They're true, or true enough. And as of last night, the curse is sealed away proper. You won't have any more trouble from it. Tom absorbed this with the calm acceptance of a man who'd learned not to question mountain mysteries. Sarah's doing? Sarah started it. I finished it. Good man. Tom gripped Jacob's shoulder firmly. She'd be proud of you, Jake. Wherever she is, she'd be proud. Jacob continued home, arriving at his cabin as afternoon shadows stretched across the meadow. Everything looked the same, but he saw it differently now. This wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was a watchpost, a guardian's station. He'd be living here not just to escape the world, but to protect it. Inside, the cabin welcomed him. The wrongness was completely gone, replaced by a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He built a fire the first in days and watched the flames catch and grow. Simple, honest work that grounded him after the strangeness of the ritual. As he worked, he found himself talking to Sarah. Not to her ghost, he still didn't believe in those, but to her memory, to the presence he'd felt in the seal, to the love that still connected them across the barrier of death. I understand now, he said quietly to the empty room. I understand why you couldn't tell me, why you did what you did. I understand, and I forgive you. More than that, I'm grateful. You gave me 30 years of peace before asking for this. You could have asked sooner, could have dragged me into this the day we met, but you gave me time to heal, time to build a life worth protecting. That was a gift. The fire crackled in response, and Jacob smiled. He pulled out Sarah's journals and her final letter, reading them again with new understanding. There was still so much to learn, so much she'd researched and documented. He had time now to study it all, to become the guardian she'd trained to be, but never wanted to burden him with being. That evening, he began his own journal. The first entry was simple. I, Jacob Stern, on this day, accept the role of guardian. I bind myself to the protection of the seal at Silver Point, to the watching of the sleeper, and to the preservation of innocent lives. I do this in memory of Sarah Brennan Stern, who gave her life for this duty, and in honor of all the guardians who came before. May my service be worthy of their sacrifice. He wrote by lamplight the porch lantern, burning bright again after days of darkness. Ranger dozed by the fire. Outside, the mountain settled into its evening rhythms, and Jacob felt every subtle shift, every small change. He was part of it now, connected in ways he was still learning to understand. The journey that had begun with an old woman's warning on a frozen trail had led him here to acceptance, to purpose, to a new understanding of the life he'd built and the love he'd lost. Sarah was gone, but she wasn't lost. She was woven into everything he'd become, every choice he'd made, every step of this journey. Jacob Stern had come to the mountains 30 years ago, seeking solitude and peace. He'd found it, lost it, and found it again in a form he never expected. Not the peace of isolation, but the peace of purpose. Not the solitude of avoidance, but the strength of standing watch alone. He was a guardian now, and he was home.